The vast era of agrarian civilizations stretches all the way from roughly 3,200 before the Common Era to around 1750 of the Common Era, a mere 250 years ago. The era in which civilizations dominated the globe is marked by phenomenal advances in human society, as well as, of course, countless setbacks and tragedies, many inflicted by humanity itself. It's a complex story that unfolded in somewhat different ways and at different times around the world. Big history is an especially useful way of making sense of this 5,000-year period because it brings multiple disciplines together to help us tease out large-scale trends and patterns. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, many of these trends reflect remarkable similarities wherever civilizations appeared. That's because people in different places were forced to find solutions to many of the same problems in a manner that biologists would recognize as comparable to the process of convergent evolution. In the natural world, convergent evolution explains why different species come to resemble each other, not because they are related genetically, but because they evolve similar traits in response to living in similar environments, even in unconnected regions and at very different times. A good example of convergent evolution can be seen in 4 animals that are not closely related to each other, but which evolved very similar traits because they all happen to live in areas rich in ants. The giant anteater in South America, the aardvark in Africa, the pangolin in Asia and Africa, and the echidna in Australia. No less a naturalist than Charles Darwin himself, the father of the theory of evolution by natural selection, was the first to identify convergent evolution, and he actually used this idea as powerful supporting evidence for his theory. Although agrarian civilizations didn't evolve through the same kind of natural selection that produced new living species, there are certain similarities in the processes. So let's first take a look at patterns of development resembling convergent evolution using the early civilizations that appeared in the vast Afro-Eurasian world zone as an example. In this context, Afro-Eurasia includes Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Indus Valley, East Asia, Central Asia, the Mediterranean Basin, and Europe. Later, we will link the rich and fascinating developments within all these Afro-Eurasian civilizations to the large trends that characterize the entire era. And as we consider the era within Afro-Eurasia, we will also be able to compare the distinct features of agrarian civilizations with other types of human communities that never became part of these civilizations, essentially remaining beyond their control, although not always beyond their influence, namely small-scale subsistence farming communities, pastoral nomads, and hunter-gatherers. The first thing we need to say about agrarian civilizations is that they were a brand new type of human community, one that had never existed before. We can see this clearly if we continue our analogy with the evolution of species. We generate a simple taxonomy of the human societies that we have considered previously. Of course, this taxonomy is slightly artificial because, unlike species in the biological world, human communities do not have rigid boundaries, and they often merge into each other. But like organisms in the natural world, human communities have proven themselves adept at evolving over time as they develop new solutions to new problems by using collective learning. As we have seen, small, family-sized communities of foragers were the only type of community that existed during the long Paleolithic era, which represents fully 96% of human history. Even with the appearance of cities and states, these small foraging communities continue to survive in different parts of the world, although they have pretty well vanished today. But like the physical vestiges of earlier ancestor species that continue to exist in our own bodies, these small communities also continue to exist today in the form of the nuclear and extended families that continue to make up the fabric of modern societies. As humans made the transition to agriculture, a new type of community appeared, the village. Some villages evolved into towns like Jericho and Çatalhöyük that, as we have seen, required new forms of leadership to help coordinate activities. A third type of community is that established by the pastoralists. Because pastoralists traveled with their flocks and herds, they were normally nomadic, and they were mostly organized in family or tribal units. But sometimes under charismatic leaders like Chinggis Khan or Attila the Hun, pastoral nomads created huge armies and organized themselves into vast communities, even empires. But still, compared with even the most extensive pastoral communities, agrarian civilizations were on an entirely new level of complexity again. At their most fundamental level, virtually all civilizations were rooted in cities, which are themselves incredibly interconnected and complicated. In fact, the word civilization comes from the Latin root civ, and this root can be found in words such as civis, which means citizen, civitas, which means city or city-state, and civili, which can mean civil, polite, or citizen-like. The common element here is thus the city and its citizens. So strictly speaking, when we use the word civilization, we are describing regions of the world in which cities are the largest and most important communities. Yet we need to add the qualifying word agrarian to the name of this new type of human community as a reminder that despite the size and complexity of the cities and their urban lifeways, most people still farmed for a living, and the vast urban populations were utterly dependent on successful farming in the hinterlands. Agrarian civilizations were also much larger and much more diverse than all previous human communities, linking hundreds of thousands or even many millions of farmers and pastoralists, priests and soldiers, merchants and potters, musicians and prostitutes, and rulers and scribes together into interdependent, coherent communities that shared new emergent properties. And just like the evolution of new, more complex organisms in the biological world, these new communities needed to generate much larger amounts of energy to sustain themselves. Keeping these massive, complex structures together took the efforts of millions of people who learned to extract new forms of energy from the animals, the plants, rivers, oceans, and winds provided by their environments. The bottom line here is that agrarian civilizations introduced so many changes in the human condition that their appearance clearly marks the start of a new era in human history, one that began around 3200 BCE with the appearance of the first states, and that lasted until just a few centuries ago when our species crossed an entirely new threshold of complexity and created the modern world. Now, let's consider the defining features of agrarian civilizations. The first, of course, is agriculture. All agrarian civilizations were based on the productivity of large numbers of farmers, and it was in towns and farming villages that most resources were generated. Peasant farmers, often working under powerful landlords in plantation-like conditions, provided the bulk of the foods and other produce used in the towns and cities. The environment played a critical and obvious role here. Civilizations could only appear in geographical zones that favored large-scale farming, which meant fertile soil and ready access to water. So it's hardly surprising that most ancient civilizations evolved in the valleys of great rivers like the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Nile and the Indus, and the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. In spite of the centrality of farming for civilizational sustainability, the power and prestige of agrarian civilizations was firmly based in their cities. Astonishing urban centers like Uruk in Mesopotamia, Chang'an in China, Pataliputra in South Asia, Tenochtitlan in Mesoamerica, and Rome in the Mediterranean basin. These were places of high population density, which allowed for a myriad of specialized occupations, enhanced opportunities for collective learning, and great wealth accumulation. These cities were also the hubs of the coercive power structures we call states, which were ruled by elites. They contained important symbols of those power structures, such as enormous palaces, high walls, and beautiful temples to the city's gods. The most obvious example of the concentration of power in the hands of ruling elites and states was the creation of armies, large, disciplined bodies of fighters who were used to both conquer neighbors and put down any internal rebellions. Every agrarian civilization also developed writing in some form because writing allowed elites to control resources through accounting and ideas and behaviors through laws or religious pronouncements. Finally, the elites of all agrarian civilizations sustained themselves through the collection of tributes extracted from the population under the threat or reality of coercion. Tributes are essentially levies on resources, which could include goods, labor, cash, or even people that are extracted by the state. In all tribute-taking societies, wealth was constantly flowing from the population at large to the elites who dominated the states. It was these energy flows that sustained the complex structures of agrarian civilizations. Some of these energy flows were commercial, taking the form of relatively equal exchanges of goods in markets. Whenever a peasant exchanged some wheat for some pottery or beer or clothing, this was a form of market exchange. But tributes were much less equal. They were usually demanded by states as a matter of right, but driven ultimately by the threat or the reality of coercion, like modern taxes. Direct coercion, or at least the threat of direct coercion, was one of the main mechanisms elites used to control human behavior throughout this era, which is why virtually every single agrarian civilization regarded slavery as normal. Yet even those members of the community who were technically free were subject to coercive pressure to ensure they surrendered the resources used to support elite groups and the state itself. And the pressure could be as brutal as a mafia shakedown. A book of exercises for scribes, the elite record keepers in ancient Egypt, dating from late in the 2nd millennium BCE, describes different careers and explains why it is so much better to be a scribe than a peasant. Produced during the Middle Kingdom period in Egypt, this satire of the trades was written by a scribe named Duaketi for his son Pepi. It has survived for 3,500 years to give us a penetrating look into the privileged life of an Egyptian scribe and contrast this to the decidedly less privileged life of a peasant. Here's how the book describes the life of a peasant. By day, he cuts his farming tools. By night, he twists rope. Even his midday hour, he spends on farm labor. Eventually, whether his harvest is good or bad, the peasant will be confronted by the tax collector. Then it describes the job of a scribe. Now the scribe lands on the shore. He surveys the harvest. Attendants are behind him with staffs. Nubians, who are mercenaries from lands to the south of Egypt, are armed with clubs. One Nubian says to the peasant, "Give your grain." "There is none," the peasant replies. He is beaten savagely. He is bound, thrown in the well, submerged head down. His wife is bound in his presence. His children are in fetters. His neighbors abandon them and flee. Now, this might be satire, but the point it makes is painfully clear. To those who were forced to pay them, tributes often felt like pure extortion. We get a similar sense of the violent relationship between governor and the governed in another ancient Egyptian source, the Nama palette, which depicts an early Egyptian ruler, probably Nama, also known as Menes, the first ruler of a unified Egypt, who was holding a captive and threatening to beat or kill him. Images like this can be found in all early agrarian civilizations, and they suggest that the role of coercer was one of the most important roles played by rulers. If you were born into the elite class, of course, life would have seemed very different, and the wealth that flowed towards you must have seemed part of the natural order of things. We get a glimpse into the life of elites in the very first agrarian civilization that emerged in Mesopotamia, in the famous Standard of Ur, a 4,500-year-old mosaic found in the royal cemetery at Ur. It has two sides, one depicting peacetime activities, the other depicting war. The peace side shows wealthy people banqueting while peasants or slaves bring in the foodstuffs the elites are consuming. Keep in mind that although we have talked thus far as if agrarian civilizations were single entities, in fact, they were never as coherent as living organisms. Like all human communities, they had boundaries of a sort, boundaries that indicated a clear difference between an insider and an outsider, between one of us and one of them. But these boundaries were never absolute, and different civilizations often merged to form larger and more unified civilizations during times of expansion, or divided to form several distinct smaller civilizations during periods of contraction. Borders were often deliberately kept porous because agrarian civilizations had very good reasons to seek out relations with communities far away from their heartlands, whether through trade or through conquest. Sometimes attempts were made to construct more rigid and distinct borders, particularly as a form of defense against militarized nomads. The walls constructed by Chinese, Indian, and Roman rulers were genuine defensive fortifications that sent a clear message to outsiders that this was the edge of the civilized world and you were not permitted to enter. But as we see time and again throughout the era, despite the impressive dimensions of fortifications like Hadrian's Wall in Britain or the Great Wall of China, they almost never worked. Let me now try and identify the key long-term trends of this era of agrarian civilizations, trends that will help guide us through our investigation of the entire era that follows. The first trend is that despite regular cycles of expansion and contraction within individual civilizations, on the big history scale, we see overall a story of the relentless expansion and increasing size, power, and effectiveness of agrarian civilizations and their administrations over thousands of years. One way of measuring this is to think about the actual size of the geographical areas civilizations controlled as a percentage of the area of the globe under state control today, which would, of course, be 100%. This includes the oceans too. Even though international law holds that the high seas are not under the control of any individual state, the international community together can fairly be said to control them by such means as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. At the beginning of the third millennium before the Common Era, the only agrarian civilization in the world was in Sumer in Southwest Asia, essentially the delta region of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It controlled only about 0.2% of the area controlled by modern states today. By 4,000 years later, in roughly 1000 CE, agrarian civilizations controlled about 13% of the area controlled by modern states. And by 1300 CE, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire ever constructed, by itself controlled a whopping 25% of the area controlled by modern states. Now, this sort of geographical expansion was only possible because ruling elites got better and better at their jobs. Over time, rulers of individual city-states learned to become more skillful and more powerful until pharaohs and emperors and kings were ruling enormous empires. States also took on a wider range of functions, extracting more tribute, building larger armies, constructing roads and other infrastructure to facilitate the movement of armies and keep their empires together, and establishing law and order over large areas. The second trend is the establishment of significant networks of exchange between all agrarian civilizations. This was certainly true in Africa and in the Americas, but the most notable Afro-Eurasian example is the Silk Roads, which led to increasing connections between civilizations and to the establishment of vast trans-regional networks. By the first century of the Common Era, most of Afro-Eurasia was linked together by the Silk Roads into one huge zone of collective learning, exchanging ideas, goods, people, technologies, and religions, and creating the most dynamic region of collective learning the world had ever seen. The more interconnections there existed between these different communities, the more knowledge accumulated, the more collective learning flourished, and the faster was the pace of change. A third trend is the increasing complexity and interdependence of social relations, one of the key themes of this entire course. Wherever we look during the era of agrarian civilizations, we see more rigid, hierarchical social structures being established. And like the caste system in ancient South Asia, these hierarchies were explicitly supported by secular and religious law codes. Bound up with this is the embedding of patriarchal structures in virtually all agrarian civilizations as a means of regulating gender relations, also clearly articulated and justified in state and religious law. Now, a final trend might be surprising to you. Despite this trend towards expansion, the increasing trans-regional connections, and the more complex social interactions, when viewed on the scale of big history, the era of agrarian civilizations is actually characterized by its generally slow pace of change, certainly when we compare this to the pace of change in our modern era. Having said that, there is no doubt that compared to the eras of human history that preceded it, the early agrarian and the Paleolithic era, significant growth did occur during the era of agrarian civilizations, encouraged by innovation, by trade, and by the increased power of the state. These innovations included the development of important new technologies like more complex irrigation structures, or the wheel, or bronze and iron tools and weapons, or coinage, writing, mathematics, the compass, textiles, and of course advanced military technology such as the invention of chariots or stirrups or catapults, even gunpowder. Beyond doubt, this is an impressive list. Another impressive measure of growth during the era is a five-fold increase in global human populations between roughly 3000 BCE and 1000 CE, from approximately 50 to 250 million people. But we must also acknowledge that there were significant barriers to growth during the era of agrarian civilizations. And the most significant barrier of all was the essentially militaristic, tribute-taking nature of most elites in pre-modern states. All the evidence suggests that ruling elites in agrarian civilizations were generally opposed to commercial and agricultural innovation because investing resources in raising productivity and seeking out new trading opportunities was generally seen as unreliable and unrewarding, and as the returns would only become apparent sometime in the future, politically useless. Governments survived by extracting tributes, not through commerce. And although they indirectly encouraged trade by building roads and establishing law and order, more often they were hostile to traders and stifled their activity. This hostility to commerce and the merchants that carried it out is clearly articulated in some of the speeches of aristocratic Romans like Cato the Elder and Cicero, both of whom regularly extolled the virtues of agriculture and condemned commerce as being vulgar and beneath a gentleman. Even the great Chinese philosopher Confucius implied something of an elitist attitude towards commerce when he wrote, "The noble man does what is right, the lesser man does what is profitable." The business of government in the era of agrarian civilizations was simple: waging war, looking after the interest of their own elite groups, and constructing monumental architecture. Just think of the vast amounts of money, labor, and materials squandered on constructing massive monuments to themselves and to their gods. A good example of this is the construction of the Acropolis in ancient Athens, particularly the Parthenon, a magnificent architectural triumph that has been a symbol of Athenian brilliance for more than 2,000 years. But the construction of the centerpiece of the project, the temple known as the Parthenon, cost an absolute fortune. In the first year alone, Athenian ruler Pericles spent the extraordinary amount of 5,000 talents, something approaching $7 billion today, and the building eventually took 15 years to complete. The fact is, and this is particularly relevant to the history of the expansion of Afro-Eurasian civilizations, with expenditures like this, most ruling elites who wanted to increase their resources were forced to tackle the problem of growth through warfare. Growth, in effect, became a zero-sum game that necessitated taking what others had produced rather than trying to increase productivity within the state. And this helps explain the almost constant warfare and attempts at expansion through the conquest of one's neighbors that so characterizes the era. Another barrier to growth was the fact that all ancient cities were unhealthy places with limited sanitation and large numbers of people crowded together, and this acted as a check on population growth. Ancient Rome had a population of more than 1 million people, and Chang'an, the great imperial capital of the Chinese Tang dynasty, had closer to 2 million people. But in most cities of the ancient world, more people died than were born, so that cities effectively functioned as demographic sinks that continuously checked population growth throughout the era. The main reasons for this: there were few means of removing sewage, the drinking water was polluted, the air was polluted from manufacturing workshops, and as a consequence of all this, diseases flourished. Pre-modern cities kept growing only because of migrations from the country, not because of their own internal population growth. Military expeditions and the gradual expansion of trade between agrarian civilizations were also sources of disease. In the early centuries of the Common Era, soldiers and merchants returning to both the Roman Empire and Han China often brought with them diseases from Central Asia, which their people had no immunity to. The result of these health and disease barriers was that the pace of population growth and innovation were both constantly being checked, which meant that innovation could rarely keep up with what population growth there was. This led to another more basic but crucial factor that limited population growth during the entire era of agrarian civilizations: the lack of food. Remember, agriculture remained the foundation of all ancient civilizations, but with slow growth in agricultural output, because there was little technological innovation in the sector, populations were subject to periodic famines. The result was long-term cyclical patterns of population growth and decline. These patterns were first highlighted in the work of English academic Thomas Malthus, who in his 1798 publication, An Essay on the Principle of Population, argued that, contrary to the then prevailing view that society is always improving, historically population growth has always been checked by famine and disease. He identified a number of such Malthusian catastrophes throughout history, which illustrate the inevitability of population decline once growth outpaces sustainability. Now, if we were to illustrate this on a graph, we'd see a steady rise and fall of populations from ancient times through to the 20th century, as populations reached a peak at various times of civilizational expansion, only to collapse because these levels were unsustainable. There is absolutely no evidence of any sort of sustained upward trend until the modern era. The cycles that Malthus detected affected not only population levels, but all aspects of society. They explained, for example, how in times of population growth, money raised through tribute was available for architecture, like the Parthenon, and for what we might call high culture, including literature and the philosophy of Plato or Confucius. But in times of contraction, when populations shrank, governments fought each other for scarce resources. In the 20th century, French historian Leroy Ladurie described these cycles of expansion and contraction as the immense respiration of an entire social structure. A superb analogy that captures the inevitable rise and fall of populations and indeed of entire civilizations over thousands of years. The ultimate result of all this, clearly reflected in these Malthusian cycles, was that the scale of innovation in the era of agrarian civilizations was sluggish compared to the explosive levels of the modern era. Innovation was never able to keep pace with population growth for very long, so the pace of change remained slow, and there were always periodic crashes as populations surged ahead of the capacity of society to produce enough food and enough goods. Malthusian cycles are one of the key tools big historians use to make sense of this era of agrarian civilizations, and indeed of the modern era that follows, which so far at least seems to have found a way out of the grip of such cycles. With this reality in mind, let me leave you with a couple of final questions. Why is growth and innovation so much faster today? Why have we not seen a dramatic population decline in the 20th and 21st centuries, which is what we would have expected given this long history of cycles, especially given some of the terrible setbacks humanity has suffered in that period, including 2 world wars and a global influenza pandemic? We will search for answers to those questions as we look more closely at how modern civilization came to be.